Orient might be the best low-cost watch brand. Hailing all the way from Japan, they're a sister company of watchmaking juggernaut Seiko, as well as their high-end luxury offshoot, Grand Seiko. I've reviewed dozens of Orient watches over the last few years. While they're not nearly as good as Grand Seiko, they nonetheless offer unique designs, punchy colours and high-quality materials that often rival or beat the mainline Seiko watches for considerably lower prices. But which Orient watches are truly the best? Well, thanks to Orient specialist TUS Watches, we're going to find out. I've explored their entire range to pick out what I think are the best value options in each category. We've got dive watches, dress watches, pilot watches, and even chronographs in here too for your viewing pleasure, some of which you definitely won't have seen anywhere else. I'll give you a brief overview of each, along with some pros and cons, and at the end of the video, I'll even go over some Orient watches that I think are worth avoiding. All of them are affiliate linked in the video description for your convenience, so head there if you want to check them out. Orient Star, which is Orient's premium line, they're going to be saved for a separate video because they command a higher price tag. We have to start with dive watches, as that's where Orient has received acclaim in recent years. Orient's flagship divers are the Ray and Mako series. Traditionally, the Rays feature standard loomed markers, while the Makos have some numbered indexes mixed in, though they're functionally identical to one another. These days, there are several versions available with different visuals and performance. Here's what you need to know. The Ray 2 and Mako 2 were released simultaneously in 2016, making them among the most time-tested models on this list. Due to their high production quantity and age, these are also some of the lowest cost Orient divers. While I can't quote exact figures as prices tend to fluctuate, they often retail for 30 to 40% less than others I'll be mentioning today. Surprisingly, this lower cost doesn't secure you a great deal less performance. They both retain the same strong 200-meter water resistance rating as the other models in the range, boasting true diver features as well, like rotating bezels, screwbacks, and threaded crowns. This rating is double the aquatic performance of most similarly priced Seiko divers too, so the Ray and Mako 2 can cope with just about anything you throw at them. While these are older, they're still constructed well even by modern standards. With hardy stainless steel cases, they feel great both in the hands and on wrist. From the looks of it, these have each received minor tweaks to keep up with the times. Compared to footage from several years ago, the stock bracelets now have an additional micro-adjustment hole, while the blue Ray 2 that TUS provided appears to be marginally better finished than the Ray 2 I previously reviewed, with sharper edges and straighter flanks. Between the Ray 2 and Mako 2, I prefer the former, especially the blue version, whose sunburst dial easily eclipses the matte black variant. There are a few things worth mentioning here. Some models ship with a rubber strap, and while the strap was reasonably good, it was pretty long. So if you've got a thin arm like me, I'd insist opting for the bracelet instead, which you can adjust to your needs. In fact, the bracelet is way better than I expected, and just as good as those fitted to most more expensive Orient watches. Due to having compact dials and tapered bezels that are substantially narrower than the case width, the Ray and Mako 2 also wear a touch smaller than other Orients with similar dimensions. Now, there are two main areas where these last-gen models fall short: case finishing and crystals. Now, while the finishing has improved a bit, they're still quite simplistic, and they lack some of the fancy techniques used on other models. From a functionality perspective, the mineral glass used on these also isn't as scratch resistant as the sapphire that Orient tends to use on its newer releases, so expect this to get scuffed and scraped in the long run. Talking of newer releases, we haven't yet seen a Ray 2 successor, but we do have a Mako 3. I reviewed this one shortly after its release and was very impressed with how premium the watch looked straight out of the box. The burnt orange version in particular was far more striking and unique than the previous gen models, which had a habit of looking somewhat run-of-the-mill. This model shipped with the aforementioned sapphire crystal, high polished chamfers on the flanks, and a meteor squared off bezel, combining to make the watch look more upmarket. Overall, the move was successful, and for the most part, the Mako 3 is better than the Mako 2. That said, if you're after a huge uptick in finishing or materials, you won't find it here. Outside of the crystal, the Mako 3 is still built similarly to its predecessor, with the main improvements coming via cosmetic alterations. Of course, this makes it a highly subjective topic. I'd take this over the Mako 2 for the extra money, but I'll let you decide for yourself. The Mako 3 comes in a wider range of more vibrant colours than the conservative Mako 2, with the only minor downside being reduced clarity due to the sapphire crystal being hazier than the mineral and lacking a top-tier anti-reflective coating to mitigate it. That said, if there were one Mako branded diver that I'd recommend, it's this: the Orient Mako Sport. Also known as the Mako 40 and reference to its size, the sport model had a controversial launch, where the entire launch lineup initially shipped with a faulty chapter ring, where the space between the second markers was completely messed up on a certain section of the dial. Fortunately, Orient has since corrected this issue, and I'm glad they did because this model was arguably my favourite release of the entire year. As with the Mako 3, I have done a full review of this model, but in short, the Mako Sport is a slightly smaller Mako variant which comes with a case-matched bezel and a glorious sleek dial with a compact date wheel and presented in a stunning array of classy colours. It also drops the crown guards to form a sexy sport dress hybrid that would look right at home alongside far more expensive brands. Out of those available, my favourite is probably the purple version, though the white version also looks much better than the stock images, with an unexpected sunburst all of its own. With the chapter ring issue now fixed, the only notable nag is the 20mm bracelet and strap. The bracelet, while good quality like the others, isn't very well integrated and doesn't taper towards the clasp, meaning it looks a little out of proportion considering the reduced nature of the piece. Meanwhile, the leather bands that some versions ship with, they're just absolute garbage. Regardless, I still think this is the best Orient watch to date, as well as the most versatile. So if you take one thing away from this video, check out the Mako Sport and see what you think. Other brands would be charging $1,000 for this. Perhaps the only model in with a shout of beating the Mako Sport is the Kamasu. This model looks just like the name suggests, with an aggressive shark-inspired design featuring tapered, tooth-like hour markers and an extra pointy handset, presented in an array of vibrant tones that leave little to be desired, some with colour-matched bezels, others without. Under the hood, this is essentially the same as the Mako 3, so most of those points apply here too. This watch proved extremely popular straight out of the gate, likely due to the striking, unique design, which was a departure from Orient's historically more safe styling. When Seiko started pulling out of the sub £200 space a few years ago, the mantle of best affordable diver easily rested on the Kamasu's shoulders. Possibly due to the punchier dials, the Kamasu suffers less from the sapphire glare issue impeding the similar Mako 3. And I'd say the more substantial applied indexes on the Kamasu even provide a higher quality aura when looked at up close. While not an old watch, it's typically available for less than the newer Mako 3 with identical proportions and materials. Thus, it competes with the fantastic Mako Sport in terms of price to performance. So far, I've tried 3 colours of this, the green, navy and red. It's funny because the burgundy red one boasts the most luxurious and arguably the dressiest appearance, yet it's probably the one I'd reach for last. It's got a glorious high contrast sunburst which humbles the others, but it ships with a divisive black plain bezel that I'm not entirely on board with. While more subdued, the remaining pair are more cohesive and will probably stand a better chance of fitting your wardrobe. My pick is probably the teal green, with the blue being the safest bet. As well-rounded as the Kamasu is, it shares some minor downsides with all the models I've mentioned so far. The bezels tend to have a little backplay and lack the tactile sound and precise feel of some rival brands. Their low-light performance, while reasonable, also falls short of Seiko and Citizen. Nevertheless, these watches do share the same great in-house movement, specifically the Orient Caliber F6922, which is used widely across the product stack. It's comparable to the Citizen Miyota 8000 series and the Seiko NH series in terms of performance, but with superior accuracy and a significantly quieter rotor than the Miyota in particular. From my experience, Orient's quality control is also better than Seiko and Citizen on these lower end pieces, something that's often overlooked with so much focus on on-paper specifications. Due to the case sharing thing I mentioned before, it's also worth noting that you can switch bracelets between certain models. For example, Mako 3 bracelets will work with the Kamasu and vice versa. Speaking of case sharing, I always had the impression that the Kamasu V2 was a bigger watch than its predecessor from the stock images. However, it turns out that, again, it's near identical, with the only change coming via brushing on the flanks of the watch. Don't worry if you're after something larger, by the way, we'll get to that in a second. On the other models sharing this case, the high-polished chamfer struggles to distinguish itself from the already polished flanks. Here though, the lip is much more clearly defined due to the alternating finishing, which gives the illusion of a slightly slimmer case. The dial here is an absolute banger too. TUS sent over this gorgeous teal version with a beautiful gradated finish that works perfectly with a faux patina lume surrounding it. It's way more vivid than the teal Kamasu V1, and it looks fancier from a distance as well, making it my preferred pick, at least for that colour. In essence, the Kamasu V2 design is like a halfway house between the Ray and the original Kamasu. It's got the Kamasu handset and case, combined with a more traditional marker array closer to the Ray or even the likes of the Rolex Submariner. My only gripe with this one is that the lume on the hands is yellower than that on the markers, as you can see, but I wouldn't say it's annoying enough to throttle its appeal. The Komatsu V2 is another one of those pieces that your friends will probably think you spent a lot more on. While I don't mind brands releasing variants of the same surefire hit, I perhaps prefer it when they do start to experiment. That's where the Triton comes in. On the surface, it's akin to the Komatsu V2, which is perhaps where my previous sizing misconception came from. However, when side by side, you'll see the Triton is a considerably larger beast. Its 43mm diameter commands considerably more wrist presence, though I wouldn't call it huge, as the lug-to-lug is shorter than some other big watches I've encountered, and the piece is still as slim as the rest at only 13mm. The Triton's got a Seiko-style layout, with the crown positioned at 4 o'clock. While there's a wide catalogue of Tritons available, this green and orange version is comfortably the most unique, with a quirky case colour that gives it this aged, almost bronze-like look to the steel housing. Within is also a different movement, the caliber F6722. I say different, but the performance in specs are as close to the F6922 as makes no difference. I'm guessing the stock bracelet that ships with some versions is like all the previous ones, though this particular unit ships with a NATO strap instead, which is fair for the money and comes with keepers and a buckle that perfectly match the unique case tone. On this strap, the watch is quite comfortable and doesn't look nearly as ungainly as I expected, partly because this is proportionally one of the least chunky of the bunch given its wide yet slim case. I'd surprisingly be tempted to take it on the strap over the bracelet. My wrist is 6¼ inches as well, for reference. There are some others worth considering if you do have a noticeably bigger arm. First up is the Kano we're going to go with. At 44mm, this is Orient's largest readily available dive watch, and it feels like another step up in size from the Triton, partly due to the far larger bezel, which spans the entirety of the case. The main reason the Kano never received a great deal of fanfare is because it was overshadowed by the highly popular Komatsu, which launched alongside it and shipped with a better crystal. Yet frustratingly, the Kano was resigned to only mineral, meaning it's spec'd closer to the older Ray and Mako 2. Luckily, it is usually priced to reflect that, at a cost that's similar to those last gen models. The similarities extend to the case too. While the Kano is significantly larger, its case shape and finishing are most reminiscent of the Ray and Mako 2, with simple, albeit well-cut edges. My wife has always had a soft spot for this model, despite the fact that it's far from fitting me. I'll have to get the weights out, boys. But yeah, it is quite good looking, especially considering the large size, which can sometimes look cumbersome. Unlike the others, it lacks a lume pip, which is a shame, as functionally, it's arguably the best bezel of the bunch with the tightest, securest action. That said, my favourite of the larger divers is the Orient Neo Classic. Now, despite being an on-paper disappointment with, again, only a mineral crystal, I think its distinctive retro dial and delicious colour palettes flew far under the radar on social media when this watch launched in 2022. To me, this is like a better thought-out version of the SK Diver reissue that I tore apart a few years back. The Neo Classic has a similarly busy yet far less garish dial, paired with a much sleeker case and substantially higher build quality in every department. Unlike the SK reissue, the Neo Classic boasts a full 20-bar water resistance rating, which we've come to expect from Orient divers, and it also features an infinitely better bracelet that could do with some more adjustment holes, but it's definitely usable. Now, there's one thing I did like about the SK Diver, which has at least been carried over to this watch, that being the lower crown, which you can use to rotate the internal bezel, a refreshing change of pace from the ever-present ratcheting external bezels. Size-wise, the Neo Classic hits 43.7mm across the middle, though its barrel-like shape results in a short 46.6mm lug-to-lug, meaning it's slightly more wristable than the previous two. Essentially, the Neo Classic gives you the feel of a funky retro watch, but in modern packaging. Its styling is most similar to the rare King Diver from the 1970s, though it has received minor alterations for modern audiences. It's got one fatal flaw: availability. You see, it's mostly available on grey market sites, which generally indicates the watch may be discontinued, at least in some colours, so time is probably ticking on the Neo Classic. Of all the Orient dive watches I've mentioned, here they are in order of preference. You can pause now if you want to. The other category where Orient excels is dress watches, and we'll get to those in a moment. First, I don't want you missing out on this killer deal from our sponsor, Ekster. Your new watch doesn't deserve to be embarrassed by your raggy old wallet. Luckily, Ekster makes the best slim wallets on the market, and you can now use my code BENZWC to get an additional discount on top of any existing web sales. This applies to all of their wallets, including the Parliament wallet, which is the one I've been using over the last 4 months. The Parliament is ironically smarter than the folks working in Parliament. With an RF RFID protection layer, and a special trigger mechanism that spreads your cards for smooth access. When stacked with all my cards in cash, it's only 18mm thick, so it doesn't leave you with a suspicious groin bulge either. Head to the link in the description during their anniversary sale and use code BENZWC for up to 25% off in total. Now, back to Orient. They've got a wider selection than McDonald's has e-numbers, so it can be tricky to decipher what the differences are and which are actually worth your time. The Bambino range is the first obvious point of call here. These are among the most lauded pieces on social media, and rightly so, as they offer classic designs that tend to look much more expensive than they actually are. Now, I've covered a few of these in depth before, so let's just quickly whiz over them. The original Bambino lineup includes a range of 40.5mm watches. Of these, I've looked at the V2 and V3 so far. According to TUS, the V2 is the best-selling model, with vintage styling incorporating a super slim handset and a pocket watch-like chapter ring. The V3, on the other hand, is a Bauhaus-inspired minimalist watch, so completely different. There are also other versions too, which I'll link in the video description. Really, it's character where the Bambinos shine, with heavily domed crystals and curved dials atop wafer-thin cases, making them a great match for more formal attire. Despite the aesthetic variance, performance-wise, most of these models are identical, with the same cases and movements. As with the dive watches, you can expect good performance on our time grapher. These dress Orients ended up being some of the most accurate I've ever tested. The main disadvantages of the Bambino models are the straps and crystals. It's supposedly quite expensive to make sapphire crystals that dome this heavily, so their use of the lesser performing mineral glass is somewhat understandable. However, most watches at this price do use the former, which is far more scratch resistant. While stylistically appropriate, the straps feel quite plasticky, despite being made primarily of genuine leather. They're also an awkward size due to the odd 21mm lug width, meaning replacement strap options will be more limited. They aren't unusable by any means, but they do pull back the high-end curtain a little. Aside from that, some wearers complain at the shortness of the hands on the V3 version, as well as the sizing of the 40.5mm variants, which are fairly large considering the mid-century styling. That's where the 38mm Bambino comes in. This one was a far more recent release and is very much the same goodness, just downsized. From the two I tested, I go for the silver dial one rather than the slightly underwhelming cream version, though there are two other colours available as well. If you've got an average or slimmer arm, the Bambino 38 is the no-nonsense choice. You can thank me later. There are some other notable models that share the same moniker. My favourite of these is certainly the sub-seconds Bambino, which ships in a classy champagne colour that looks head and shoulders above the stock images. It really does look like a vintage watch, perhaps even more so than the Bambino V2, with the size being the only thing that reveals its modern construction. That and the exhibition rear, which provides a peek at the automatic movement within. In a similar vein, there are these pair, the Bambino Sun and Moon, and this other one which doesn't seem to have a nickname yet. The latter is pretty much a Bambino V2, but with some additional complications on the dial and a glass case back. It's got somewhat of a pocket watch vibe, so if you like sub-dials, it could be an option. The Sun and Moon looks relatively similar from above, though from side on you'll see it's a tad thicker with the taller bezel. It's slightly wider too, and it boasts an extra degree of dial complexity, such as the day-night complication and heavily recessed day indicator, giving this model perhaps the deepest overall appearance out of any of the dress watches. Personally, I prefer more minimalist watches such as these coming up. Probably the cleanest and simplest offering from Orient, the Maestro is essentially an answer to the heavily promoted fashion brands that influencers have been peddling for the past half decade. The only difference is these aren't awful quality. It comes in both quartz and automatic, with each carrying forth a stripped down design with limited text and tasteful dials that are clearly designed for the fashion conscious. Orient may be primarily known for its mechanical timepieces, but I'd recommend considering the quartz here, which has compact proportions such as a 38.8mm diameter and a mere 9.5mm thickness. This version can also be bought on a pretty decent mesh bracelet for a chunk less than you'd probably think, and I think the colours are also more enticing. The automatic has slightly better case finishing and looks very similar, but has a more contemporary 39.9mm width, which could be a better fit for many of you watching. Unlike most Bambino models, I reckon you could pull the automatic off with a hoodie just as well as a tuxedo, thanks to the super safe visuals. Surprisingly, the Maestros also have more water resistance than the Bambino models at 5 bar, though the crystals are still only mineral, which is frustrating versus the competition. If you've considered the likes of Daniel Wellington or MVMT, either option will nonetheless provide you with better build quality and design, usually for a comparable price tag or sometimes less. Another option you may stumble across is this unnamed version, which appears really similar online. Sometimes listed under the contemporary banner, I think this is a variant of the semi-popular Orient Symphony, as it shares a similar case and materials. I never bothered covering the regular Symphony, as its aesthetic is extremely close to the Maestro already, but this version has a few discrete characteristics, such as the Roman numerals and the raised chapter ring. The standout feature of this dress model is the dial. It's got probably the cleanest silver sunburst of all the watches on this list, which you'd never expect from the flat stock images, which make it look like a white matte dial. At 42mm, I think it's a little large considering the vintage cues, but it doesn't wear quite so massively, as the lug-to-lug is a more restrained 48.5mm. It's reasonably slim at 11.7mm, including a slightly raised crystal. There aren't a huge number of these classically styled automatics available at this price, so while I don't love this piece with its mineral crystal, it's still one of the better choices. For something more adventurous, an exotic skeleton or open heart watch could add the flair you're looking for. I'd say there are two I've encountered that are worth mentioning. The first is this unspecified open heart model, which was pretty decent overall. It comes with a sapphire crystal, unlike the other dress models, and gives a sneaky view of the movement within. While its diameter is closest to the 38mm version of the Bambino, its thicker bezel, flat crystal, and chunkier case give it a completely different vibe and profile. I'll link the full review in the video description if you want to learn more. There's also this larger and arguably more attractive offering, which I again reviewed back in 2021. At the time, only this black dial was available. However, Orient has recently revamped the line with a string of lively colours, such as this shiny icy blue, whose spiral sunburst is far more exciting than the similar, yet much plainer Tiffany dials used on many alternative watches. They may have kind of jumped on the trend with this one, but I think it looks decent. While more expensive than the previous watch, this model is visually more complex, with applied markers traversing a cutaway that runs the circumference of the watch, as well as an unusual sub-seconds complication that overhangs the open heart window. Again, this one has a sapphire crystal and an exhibition rear too. The main thing missing is a decent name, as again, Orient has left the Western market with a string of digits that even Alan Turing would struggle with. If you've got a relatively big arm, it's an interesting choice nonetheless. Orient does make some other types of watches, albeit in more limited numbers than some of their Japanese contemporaries. In terms of military watches, they've got two that I think are worth considering. First in line is the Orient Defender 2. Now I have to be honest, I think this thing is pretty ugly. However, many online commenters seem to think differently, so I felt compelled to include it regardless. This is about as close to a decent field watch as you can get with Orient, though it retains a lot of pilot watch cues as well, with a two-tone handset and an assortment of highly visible indexes spanning the circumference. It also has the traditional aviator sizing, with a wide 42.5mm diameter and 49.5mm lug-to-lug, which demands your attention. I've encountered many PVD watches before, and the finishing on this version sits towards the shinier end of the spectrum, though this coating may prove more resilient than you'd expect if the results of our scratch test video were anything to go by. The PVD watch in that video scored really well. It's not a poorly made watch, it has most of the good features of the other watches. If you like the look of it, go wild, but there's a model I try and get instead, that being the Orient Pilot. It's part of the same collection, as you can see from the similar case and identical strap, but it has a cleaner look with less clutter, nicely inked numbers, and a flexed dial surface that makes it feel more upmarket. It's also slightly slimmer than the Defender, which never hurts. The 22mm nylon band used by both models, by the way, is serviceable with colour-matched appendages. Low light performance on the Pilot and Defender is also solid, partly due to the huge markers. Like the Defender, the Pilot comes in more mainstream case materials and in a range of alternate dial colours too, though this darker one looks better than I expected before ordering. While it's good looking in isolation, the main concern for this piece is competition. Its rather standardized design is offered by many other budget watch brands, some of whom provide improved specifications for less money, though returns procedures and warranties are generally more straightforward with Orient. Now, there are sadly very few Orient chronographs to feature in a list like this, with the only notable inclusion being the Mako Solar Panda. As you can see, this carries across many traits from the Mako 3 and Komatsu series I mentioned earlier, including the bezel and overall case shape, though it's bumped up to 42.5mm across with a lug-to-lug of 47.9mm. To my knowledge, this is the only solar model in Orient's current lineup. It's powered by a Seiko Epson VS75, which is one of the few quartz chronographs with a semi-sweep that matches the smoothness of a mecha quartz. I'd love to see them make use of these rechargeable movements more often, especially in place of standard quartz, as the 6-month battery life when charged makes them a highly practical choice. Unlike some diver-inspired chronographs, This one maintains the strong performance and functionality of the regular diver models, with a proper screw back and a screw down crown. Of course, like the Pilot, this is far from the only Panda chrono out there, with the design being a mainstay of the watch industry. The most interesting parts of this one are the loomed markers, which offer up a quirky pale blue tone, as well as the heavily recessed subdials whose cutouts are lined with high polished chamfers to play with the light. A minor nitpick of mine is that the luminous hands don't accurately match the markers, and while that's forgivable on faux patina watches where it can kind of emulate the differing deterioration rates of lume, on a fresh design like this it doesn't fit quite so neatly. Still, the Orient Panda is an attractive watch overall. If you don't like the monochrome design, it is buyable in other colorways that match the other Mako watches. While Orient watches are generally a safe bet with some leeway for subjectivity, there are also some models that I think are just still worth avoiding. First up is that one I mentioned earlier, the SK Diver reissue. Now I think this one is hideous, and I think if you're after a retro watch, you should consider the Neo Classic I mentioned earlier instead. Nevertheless, many commenters on my review video for this one disagreed and thought it was gorgeous. And even if that's true for you, please bear in mind that this watch is constructed pretty poorly. The finishing is below par, the head of the watch is huge and heavy, and the water resistance is a measly 5 bar despite the diver styling. What's worse is the bracelet may as well have come off a $20 Casio. It's far too light and made of folded links, meaning the weight balance is completely off when on wrist. It doesn't even integrate with the case whatsoever, and has been left with a rubbish clasp that will likely leave you in the lurch. If you really want that one, just don't submerge it and factor in the cost of a better band when you buy it, albeit not a NATO style one because that will balloon the super deep thickness even further. A whole series worth avoiding nowadays is the TriStar collection. A mainstay of budget collectors in days past, the TriStar collection has effectively been culled by Orient, with the last update coming many years ago. These days, their bang average materials, dated designs, and uncompetitive prices mean they're completely outclassed by other budget watches, especially those from AliExpress. Perhaps Orient lacks the resources to support or upgrade the TriStar in a similar manner to the Seiko 5 series, but even so, they're underwhelming in the 2020s. If you thought the TriStars were poorly priced, check out this. On marketplace sites like eBay, you'll often find greedy sellers attempting to flip limited edition Orient watches for double or triple their RRP. I'm gonna be straight with you, Orient watches, they're decent, but they're not worth 500, 600, 700 quid. At that price, you can instead buy an Orient Star or some other higher end brand instead. If you start buying these entry level watches at super inflated prices, these rats will keep appearing in droves. Don't feed them. All the watches I mentioned today are affiliate linked in the video description, along with a link to our favourite Orient dealer, TOS Watches. Comment below if you'd like to see a similar video about Orient Star, but for now, here's a roundup we did previously on Seiko. I'll see you there in 3, 2,